The internet is cracked, the show that asks the question, can we coexist with our creation?
Hey, I'm Seth Camillo.
And I am Caroline Risberg, and we are The Internet is Cracked by Addicts for Addicts.
And today we are so lucky to have Anita Say Chan with us. And she is a professor at the University of Illinois and is a widely recognized scholar and author whose work has taken her from rural Peru to global policy forums. With her research featured in leading academic and cultural institutions around the world. Her most recent book is Predatory Data: Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. We're so excited to have you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you both for having me.
Yeah, thank you so
Wonderful.
much. Thank you. So let's jump to it. So I want you to tell us about your book, Predatory Data, and what does the term actually refer to?
So it is, of course, sort of framing data immediately in a kind of countervalence to the sort of normalized dominant story that we
Mm,
have heard repeatedly over and over again, from media outlets to mainstream news outlets to even academic and research institutions and knowledge making institutions. It's sort of the default narrative we have about data, which is that data is oil, data is the new gold, data is a
mm,
thing that will unlock a kind of new secrets of knowledge making, and
mm,
unlock the key to sort of hyper productive global economic productivity and wealth. We just need to access it.
Yeah.
That story and that narrative is one around data that is completely driven by industry. It is, of
mm,
course, not the way that normal households, citizens, and especially people who represent minoritized populations
mm,
experience data. And if anything, the dominant infrastructures that we have around data and the kinds of methods that we have for assessing, using, and applying data such that it does appear to generate all this kind of new wealth and productivity around us, all of those things are drawn from deeply predatory data methods and applications that have been that way for well over a century,
mm,
and that have really been built on the backs and the security of minoritized populations, especially, but really increasingly wider and wider swaths of just vulnerable populations that include everyone from sort of women writ large to youth populations writ large that are just experiencing this degree of hyper surveillance and profiling because their data is so valuable to industry.
oh,
And
wow.
that kind of leads into
Yeah.
our second question, which is, can you discuss, you use the word historical eugenics with data-driven technologies. Can you sort of parse that for us?
Yeah.
Talk about what that means? Because
Yeah.
it's
Well,
quite a strong statement, obviously.
yeah.
Mhm,
Yes,
mm,
yes. Well, I mean, in so many ways, I wrote this book as a love letter to my students in information sciences, many
mm,
of whom go on to have professions and careers in AI and data science, and data professional industries, in Silicon Valley and across the world, and many of whom, especially right now, feel deeply ambivalent about it. And there is a reason that they do, and so much of that ambivalence has to do with their kind of sense that this is not just something that's been a kind of problematic practice in the now. It really does have a much, much deeper history, and that has to do with its ties to eugenics. But again, many of my undergraduates and even sometimes graduate students are pretty disconnected or unfamiliar with what even a history of eugenics was. They might
right.
hear the word and think like, oh, wasn't that something that had to do with Nazi Germany once
Mhm,
upon a time? They don't remember that, in fact, it had a deep, deep history in the US, and that decades before the prominence and rise of the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, it was really the US, and also the UK, but the US in particular, that became really the premier site for eugenics advocacy, policymaking, modeling of what eugenics datification could really do. and the supposed promise that it would have to essentially build out a eugenics society on the kind of routinized and normalization of hypersurveillance and profiling of populations, especially minoritized populations, to essentially supposedly track out and filter out the dysgenic populations and populations that would be degrading and that would risk the kind of future, put the rest of the nation at risk for contamination, genetic contamination in their framing that would lead to a kind of demise, economic and national demise of nations. But eugenics really was a kind of, I mean, and its simplest form was a race science.
Mm.
And one of the most prominent ones that really fundamentally believed, of course, in an inequality of humankind, and the very unlike, of course, the sort of liberal tenets that all men, of course, are created equal, humans are created equal, and that our institutions of liberal politics, in fact, are ones
Mhm.
that enable some version of equal opportunity. And of course, our everything from public schools to our public infrastructures are expressions of that. Eugenicists from 100 years ago were deeply, deeply committed to a very different kind of view of society. Again, they believe from the get-go that men were created unequal, that there was a fundamental sort of inequivalence, non-equivalences between races, and that they believed in a kind of hierarchy of society.
Yeah,
Uh,
could you tell us a little bit, like, give us an
Mm.
example of eugenics in the turn of the century?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the book, of course, goes deep into that. But so Francis Galton, I think, is sort of the kind of key eugenicist that I would love our listeners to all sort of take away from.
Okay.
Was the founder of eugenics, a British biostatistician, also a cousin to Charles Darwin, who was obsessed with data collection. So he was also a kind of a polymath who, again, was sort of obsessed with counting and trying to figure out, was insistent that datification could, again, sort of unlock the
Okay.
secret to a better society. Um, and he was especially interested in, again, sort of proving that the sort of liberal tenet of all men are created equal, that democratic societies, investment in welfare states, in public education was really a broken and irresponsible kind of investment. If anything, it took away resources from gifted, talented, and genius classes
Oh,
and from people like Galton's, and then later, obviously, the eugenics, a larger sort of eugenics movement that he helped to spur, that really began with research classes and knowledge classes and fellow scientists and
Mm.
people who could essentially help to, again, foment really what was the world's first massive datification movement, is what I argue in the book, that was, again, really built on the backs of profiling and hyper profiling minoritized populations in order to prove that there was a kind of natural hierarchy in society. But they were really quite anxious. I mean, this was a class, this is a sort of white patrician knowledge class that was quite anxious about the sort of new world of globalization that they
Mhm.
saw emerging in the 19th century that that expressed themselves through diversifying cities, urban environments, the kinds of sort of mingling of various classes, races, and working populations in cities like London and New York and Philadelphia,
Mm.
Chicago, etc. While many people, and of course in the U.S., we embrace this kind of heterogeneity as something that really is part of, and a part of really the kind of makeup of what the promise of the U.S. And again, many democratic societies, in terms of their embrace of pluralism, was fundamentally about. For eugenicists, it was a cause of anxiety. They were absolutely concerned and quite paranoid, in fact, that this kind of mingling and mixing, the kind of the building of pluralistic societies was going to degrade the quality of the nation.
so
Um,
Mm.
and,
so
uh,
data and disenfranchisement has gone together for a long time.
Correct. Yes, yes. And beyond Francis Galton, I mean, again, He was the father, not just sort of like of this coining of the term eugenics, which is again this kind of race
Uh,
science that was built upon essentially this conviction that you would essentially be able to datify a kind of stratification and hierarchy of humankind. They argued, and he argued from the very beginning, from his earliest treatises on eugenics, that you would find higher correlations of genius and talent amongst wealthy populations and the so-called well-born, and that you would find higher correlations of pauperism, laziness, criminality, predilections towards prostitution, licentiousness, in other words, predilections towards alcoholism and drug taking, etc. All of those things we're going to higher concentrate amongst poorer populations. And again, Galton was someone who was so convinced that, again, this sort of counting method and application to social classes across urban environments would manifest, that he would spend time even on the street corners of London counting things like attractive women,
Uh-huh.
the notion that our attractive women would be present in London's wealthier neighborhoods,
Uh,
and that there would be
oh,
less attractive women in London's, right? So again, sort of trying to use these sorts of this sort of exercise of perception,
yeah.
surveilling people secretly. He had created a sort of pocket handheld counter in his to be able to do this kind of counting with a needle and a piece of paper, so he could again surreptitiously count,
wow.
because even then, even 100 years ago, he recognized how sort of fundamentally creepy this thing was.
Wow, it is creepy.
Well,
Wow.
let's fast forward to today. What
Yeah.
similarities? I mean, things are maybe a little less clearly defined, or maybe they're not less clearly defined. I guess that's a question for you. In terms of the way data is being used to disenfranchise people today.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, in so many, I think, in too many ways, I would
Yeah.
say. I would just say that our kind of, our the way our entire internet ecology and the way that most people experience data nowadays is really one that's very much bent on and built upon the sort of methods and sort of logics of stratifying populations that Galton had come up with, and his fellow eugenicists over 100 years ago. The most sort of clear tie that many of my, again, undergraduates in information sciences forget, or just never sort of even given any kind of familiarity and taught about the history of their own practice. So, a kind of statistical regression, which is sort of this method for predictive correlation, to basically datify populations, and then based upon your data pools, enable some version of prediction of what will come next. Right? It's how
Ah,
large
okay.
language models operate when we're using ChatGPT or any kind of LLM. It's also how our profiling operates when we're using Amazon or any kind of commercial application that essentially gives us recommendations, Netflix and streaming, etc. All of those things are built upon a kind of predictive ecology, and that fundamental method within data is called statistical regression. This is all something it is Francis Galton who came up with that method literally more than 100 years ago, who based upon, again, his own anxiety that unless we were able to come up with these sorts of methods for datifying populations and then demonstrating through prediction what would happen if we let
Okay.
these populations continue to mix. He was
Mm,
absolutely convinced that the more that we datafied populations, the more we would actually be able to demonstrate that, yes, genius correlated more with the wealthy, and that, yes,
mm,
criminality and pauperism correlated more, laziness and the kind of predilection towards things that would essentially lead to poverty and the decline of nations would concentrate more amongst the unwell born, amongst the dark, poor, immigrant classes, etc. Uh,
ah,
this statistical regression is sort of like the common link methodologically
mm,
between our kind of data ecology from then And now I should, again, we cannot really underscore enough how much of a data explosion this sort of, again, obsession with trying to predict a kind of potential decline of society and the kind of wrongness, essentially, which is what eugenicist obsession was, the wrongness
Right.
of democratic
Well,
policy.
even Elon Musk's um, AI,
Oh,
has a very unseemly flavor to it, at least in my opinion. Um,
oh, absolutely. I
and
mean, Rock is clearly
yeah,
I mean, in terms
I
of
know.
the kind of
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
Nazi, kind of explosion that you
Yeah.
saw on Grok, that which is X slash Twitter's, AI based application and bot. The fact that it sort of started to spew out Nazi
Yeah.
propaganda and hate speech, essentially, even profiling minoritized users to sort of
Yeah.
spew, as in Jewish users and other minoritized users, to start to spew this kind of rhetoric at them. I mean, really, not just incredible and not just sort of like an accident of the platform. It really is Musk's own kind of programming of a majoritarian vision of a data ecology and trying to excise a kind of even slight embrace of kind of pluralism within language models. I mean, that's absolutely no accident. You've absolutely seen a kind of, to your question around how does this connect to the kind of present. Of course, for my undergraduate students, it's sort of the method that they're using on a regular basis that all AI companies and datification companies, data-driven companies, social media companies use at a fundamental level. But we see it on a very, very regular basis now. It's been really put on the kind of highest level of public prominence in the way that you see this kind of very supposedly sudden rightward turn in Silicon Valley towards an embrace of MAGAism and an embrace really
Yeah.
of a kind of far right authoritarian kind of nationalist um, rhetoric in the name of supposedly protecting free speech. None of
well,
that
in the name of not being
Right.
regulated, I think really.
Oh,
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I
Absolutely.
mean, this
Absolutely.
is so important to understand the history of data, right?
Yes.
And in this now current digital systems, that
That's right.
we
That's
need
right.
we need to know. We need to understand
That's right.
more. Yeah.
That's right. There are, I mean, and I would say that there are multiple sort of connections between the kind of old generation of
Mhm.
eugenicists from a century ago, whether we're talking about Francis Galton or we're talking about Charles Davenport and Madison Grant. Charles Davenport, who was a Harvard graduate who ended up leading one of the most prominent eugenic datification organizations from the US called the Eugenics Record Office that helped to advocate for so many, not just sort of a normalization of datification of minoritized populations, literacy tests for poor and immigrant classes,
Mm.
um, not monitoring for various forms of unfitness in students, and so the application of IQ tests amongst, again, K through 12 age populations and students, young students, all of that were things that they were advocating for early over 100 years ago and then translated literally into national policy through the 19 not just sort of the first Chinese exclusion acts that we saw before the turn of the century in 1883 and 1875, which were very much built upon eugenics propaganda and the notion, not so much people, if you look at the wording of the bill and the fact that they first targeted Chinese women, not Chinese men. A
The
lot of our kind
Chinese
of
women.
popular thinking is that the Chinese were excluded because of their competition with laboring classes in the 19th century. Absolutely not. When you look at actually the propaganda and the kind of lobbying for the Chinese Exclusion Acts, especially the very first one, 1875, the Page Act against Chinese women that
Mm.
banned Chinese women, it was based upon supposedly their contaminating effect and the
Mm.
hereditary kinds of degradation that they would introduce into well-born white populations, not as a kind of laboring competition, but because of their status as sex workers and domestic workers within that had contact with especially middle class white men.
Well,
There were so many forms of disinformation at the turn of the
Wow.
century, but it also culminated, I'll just finish saying, in later forms of anti-immigrant acts, including our 1917 and 1924 immigration acts in the U.S. that introduced new immigrant bans uh, um, what they called essentially forms of political protesters, people who were they
Yeah.
thought of as being sort of mentally ill, but also introduced quotas to privilege Nordic classes, as in immigrants coming in from Northern Europe, and to deprioritize Jewish and Southern European and non-Nordic classes from entry into the US with, again, the
Mm.
1917 and 1924 immigration acts. It also culminated in sterilization acts in the US that
Oh,
were
yes.
implemented in over 30 states, essentially to keep unfit populations, so-called unfit populations, that were in state institutions from further contaminating well-born populations. I mean, again, the US, by the time Nazi Germany had come into fore, was already a huge testing ground and really a success case as far as eugenicists were concerned for how far eugenic advocacy could go in terms of remaking national policy to reshape and re-engineer societies at scale. And they did it over and over again through datification. Over and over again, it was researchers from the Eugenics Research Office to other forms, essentially, of research collectives that were coming out from states. There was of other eugenics research organizations that had been started by David Starr Jordan, the first founding president of Stanford University, who was a well um, known and prominent heavy eugenics advocate, who started California's own research institute dedicated to eugenics advocacy, and made California one of the first states across the nation to put in place a sterilization act for unfit citizens, essentially in state custody. Researchers over and over again were part of, and their visualization and publication and circulation of data that demonstrated or attempted to demonstrate, essentially through disinformation and propaganda, what would happen if the U.S. enabled or continued to allow these sort of open gates of immigration, open mingling between classes, and different forms of races across urban environments. That what would the danger that would introduce, and if we didn't have other forms of stopping it through things like sterilization, immigration bans, forms of stratifying even classrooms and populations, even at the kind of early age of K through 12 education. If we didn't do something like that, again, to keep the well-born population protected, we would essentially have this kind of degradation of society.
Well, the thing that, does
Oh,
strike me about, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily related to eugenics so much as, Grok is a very obvious, a very, very obvious, uh, um, violator of rights. But I think so much of I use ChatGPT in almost maybe what's, it's a sheep and a wolf in sheep's clothing,
yeah.
in that at least with
Yeah.
Google, you used to go to a site so you would know whose perspective you were working with. And now you just get answers from the cloud, and I find that to potentially be dangerous.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's a very, very fundamentally anti-humanistic kind of ethos that powers today's AI companies. They are really, really fundamentally just the kind of conceit. So the kind of connect the dots between our past eugenicists and our current age of techno eugenicists. You're absolutely right, Seth, that the kinds of heads from Sam Altman
Yeah.
to Elon Musk to Peter Thiel to Mark Zuckerberg of our most sort of commonly used nowadays social media media, and now AI-based platforms are really,
Mm.
and of course, they're all melding because Twitter and Facebook and Google,
Yeah.
they're all deeply, deeply invested, of course, in building out their own AI
Of
agents.
course, of course.
It is a very, very, it's an even, one could say that it's a darker even economy than what we had in terms of the social media economy of the 2000 and let's say tens and twelves, where it almost seems quaint to remember that there was a time when Google would say things like, we're the company that does no evil.
Yes.
Nowadays, what you hear from Google heads, and in fact, there was a leaked memo that circulated quite recently by Sergey Brin, who's of course, one of the heads of Google, basically saying to his AI workers, right? And once upon a time, we had this kind of a notion of like Silicon Valley workers as this sort of super, like they got the jobs that allowed them to play, and it was a super elite job, and it allowed this sort of like
Mhm.
fantasy of like what would happen in a future information economy when our everyone's work really got to basically look like an information the bear the fruits of the information age, and everyone's work would suddenly look like play. They were supposedly modeling that, right? And we remember the 2000s and the early 2010s even, where all these photos that would circulate of like Google Place workspaces that look like play spaces, right?
Yes.
Like free
Right,
laundry, great
right.
lunch, and all that. Now, fast forward to 2024, 25, you're getting essentially, I mean, not like deeply, deeply abusive practices that are being reported from inside the heart of tech, precisely in this kind of, that are demonstrative of really this kind of the way that this kind of anti humanistic turn now even applies to even supposedly the promised land of like even the workers that were supposed to have the most sort of well protected jobs are
Yeah.
by no means being told they're well protected. And I'll mention a couple of things. One, again, is
Yes.
the Sergey Brin memo that he circulated amongst workers saying the sweet spot, folks, I need you all to be in the offices longer. And I expect you expect and would think that we all need to normalize that we should have all be in the office 60 hours a week. The
Yep.
40-hour a week for folks are dragging everybody down. They're demoralizing us, in fact. When this was leaked, of course, it was sort of like a public outcry, but amongst workers, they'd already started to see this kind of shift towards this kind of, from, the I don't know what you would call it, this kind of, playground ethic for tech workers to instead this kind of much more authoritarian kind of mode of economic management, and that this is the way now that the not economic logics and
Yeah.
labor and productivity needs to get extracted. So 60 hours a week is the sweet spot, is a new expectation.
Oh my god.
Also, the kind of we've seen, of course, the kind of there was lots of sort of publicity around the way also Elon Musk was now sort of demanding, and
Yeah.
has really sort of locked that, like, demanding a kind of exceptional degree of loyalty from workers, especially at X. That if you don't demonstrate that to me, any version of sort of now interlocution, like thinking about ourselves as sort of now experts in open dialogue, forget that. It's top down. The
Mm.
remands are coming from here, and, if I want Grok to sound less woke, we're gonna make that happen in the next couple of days. This wasn't an accident
Yeah.
of
No.
programming a version
Right,
release. This is
right,
absolutely something that it was like mirroring,
right.
Musk's own kind of like long anti-woke kind of agenda, and threats to sue the Anti-Defamation League for supposedly trying to destroy X and Twitter and his companies by essentially just pointing out how much hate speech had already grown on those platforms. I mean, really, his kind of like the kind of paranoia and the means by which you see these tech company heads now
Right.
exercising a kind of vision for what it takes to kind of build the future, um, and that it's this version of like, I it doesn't look like a democratic society by any means. It is like fully locked down, and you'll see it in one other thing, which is like obviously now we've seen the kind of the reports over the last year, and especially over the summer of these kind of like sweeping layoffs that are happening even in the tech industry. I
Yeah.
mean, literally tens of thousands of workers.
Yeah.
We've also seen, of course, like reports about how much this is impacting even like new entry level workers with college graduates.
Yeah.
You'll see, folks. I mean, there are graduates from universities like Purdue University.
Mm.
Remember from the summer the a New York Times article that was just sort of making a little bit of like kind of both underscoring just this kind of anxiety in recent graduates, but especially looking at graduates with really once upon a time very valuable degrees.
Yeah.
So women CS graduates, computer science graduates from Purdue University, a top engineering university in the U.S. who were unable to find jobs and essentially whose job hunt, I mean, this student in particular was really publicizing and amplifying and sharing what was going on with them with their job search and sharing that of the many companies that they had circulated their CV among, the only one that had bitten was Chipotle, the fast food company.
Oh, I did hear. Wow.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, there really is an unsettlement. We've been reading probably about the economic reports of how many companies have already started in anticipation of a new AI-based economy and kind of following the lead that they've been hearing from the tech industry and from even university heads of like how this thing is going to yield enormous promises, how these
Yeah.
LLMs are already, ready to hit the market. They're already disruptive. So they've been planning essentially and starting to make hiring plans that we already saw
Yeah.
impacting this summer's graduates and their unemployment
My
rate.
question is,
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
is it true that the AI will be able to do the jobs? And two, what does it mean? What will
Oh,
society look like?
absolutely not. It doesn't. So it is the problem is not will AI be able to do the jobs? Like it's already failing. There was a report by MIT that
Mm.
was released this summer that demonstrated that 95%. They did a kind of survey. It was from their business school of essentially U.S. companies to see if AI was how it was helping to boost growth or not. 95% of them said that it was not. And
Yeah.
it's not that the question is not so much, will AI be able to do this thing? It fails. It fails all the time. All of us in academia
Yeah.
can easily sniff out when we get an essay that's turned into us from an AI bot and or not. It's not so much whether or not like when whether or not it works and if it can actually replace workers because it can't. But the issue is whether or not there are enough people that believe that it can or get
Yeah.
convinced that it can, that small population of decision makers, right? If those company heads are just
That's true.
listening and drinking the Kool-Aid from what they're seeing other Fortune 500 companies
Yeah.
do, right? That becomes a problem. It's what we end up deciding or believing or sort of just
Mm.
deciding to drink in the Kool-Aid without actually seeing empirically what's actually on the ground and happening and what workers are saying. And it's so very clear when you listen to anyone from nursing populations to even call response help desk folks. I mean that
Yeah.
the granularity of assistance that human users need to be able to navigate complex systems from
Mm.
hospital systems to payment systems to tech support, it cannot be done with an AI system. It can't be done well. I mean, some
Right.
version of it can be, of course, can keep us spinning through loop after loop of AI systems, but the issue is more around this kind of question of displacement. And again, to get back to your initial question of like what connects techno eugenesis of the past, of the present, with our eugenesis of the past, it is that deep indifference to the larger consequences of society driven by their own conceit as really elite patrician classes that they've got the right idea. They already have it all figured out. And
Yeah.
if they could just convince, as they did, policymakers and fellow elites to be able to implement their ideas at scale, they would be able to essentially sort of fix the problem that they saw that democratic society was.
Yeah.
And that kind of disdain of democracy and pluralism, that they see democracy and pluralism as actually drags on productivity, right?
Mm.
That regulation, an attempt to kind of address the needs of diverse populations, right? The concept of liberal democracy is not that we are like hyper productive. If and as it has been the case, right? Like we have pluralistic societies that are deeply creative and that become productive precisely because of our sort of base in pluralism and the way that we have been able to exercise a kind of
Mm.
um interesting, really kind of experiment in a mixing of sort of individual freedoms, and belief in the kind of capacity of humankind to really sort of discover and to make, really, regardless of where they were coming from, to be able to still make and contribute in ways that can be surprising, that
Yeah.
can't be modeled, in fact, well by predictive systems. It's why by the
Right.
end of the book, I also argue for an investment in improbable worlds, that the best of humankind and human experiment making would likely not have been predicted. They always
Mm.
come from a kind of blending of a surprising and something that probably couldn't or shouldn't have happened otherwise. Again, time and time again, when you look at different examples of pluralistic
Well,
movements, and I
they say, for
Mm.
instance, like, the theory of relativity would have certainly been discovered, but it would have taken 50 to 75 years, they believe, before it would have been discovered. So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
it
Yeah.
and where did it come from? It came from somebody working at a postal office.
yes, 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 and over again, when you see, I mean, even the very existence of a planet Earth, we are a very improbable thing in a
Yeah.
very hostile universe.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
and of
that's a
course,
good point.
whatever, you can have, like, people like Elon Musk trying to, like, try and, getting people onto Mars, etcetera. But again, these sorts of, like, his own those experiments and that attempt to sort of over and over again like really concentrate and invest resources in these fantasies that the wealthy and the elite really are the only ones who can benefit from. But the
Mm.
demonstration that they're willing to do that over and over again. I mean, this is a kind of connective tissue, right? Like
Yeah,
whether
yeah,
or not like the kind of disdain in democracy, the kind of offense at even trying to regulate. How dare you put any reins on my genius ideas and my attempt to really save the rest of the planet from really what is going to be their own sort of like demise? How dare you put any reins on me? They're willing to experiment with populations at scale. Their total indifference, that is, to like the potential consequences, harms, like none of that at all squares. It's incommensurate with their own paranoia, their own existential paranoia, and their conviction that we have to do this. Otherwise, society will fail. You
yeah,
hear people like Elon Musk over and over again sort of gesture towards, we have to do this because otherwise civilization itself will fail. He's even
yeah,
gone on like pronatalist, like trying to tell Silicon Valleyites that they need to have more babies, right? There have been articles that have been
Yes.
written about this, but you can
yes.
like it totally tracks that he wants Silicon Valleyites to have more babies as he has. He doesn't care whether they're good parents, right? He himself is like not like a model
I know, doesn't he have,
parent
like,
or
50
vessel of
kids or
care.
something?
Yes, oh yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean that we know of. Those are
what
the
we know of, yeah. I
but
didn't
he's
even know, I was like,
totally hell-bent, essentially, on, like, having Silicon Valleyites repopulate the world.
"Oh
Also
my
while
god,
still, of course, like, being in the office and sitting there, right? Like,
80
being
hours a
productive
week."
for him. Right, totally, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But, like,
You know what?
what are
Yeah,
you doing, like, letting the rest of the pop of the world, right? These dark, poor, ungenius masses, right? These
yeah,
untalented masses overpopulate the world. It's our responsibility, otherwise Western civilization will fall. I mean, it's really, yeah. So the conceit and the
yeah.
buy into their ideas
And
is
what
really
what I find is scary too is that every day now I see more and more on commercials, on everything, how they are pumping out AI. You got to use this. You got to use this. Oh, it's going to make
yeah,
your life so much better.
totally.
Oh, look at here. And you have big actors doing it and all this kind of thing. And
Oh
I'm
my
like,
gosh. And
I,
you talk to normal popula go oh, yeah, please finish
yeah,
your
no, no,
thought,
no,
Carol.
no. That's it. No, I just want to say it scares me that I'm seeing it more and
Yes,
more and more.
yes,
And we normal people, we sitting and listening. Oh yeah, if
yes.
this actor said I should get that, I should get this,
Right,
and
with
oh my
crypto,
god.
boosterism, and whatnot. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. I mean, it really is, So just to say that none of those things, I mean, all of those sort of commercials and promos are, of course, always being done by quite elite folks.
Of course,
And
of
when you
course.
talk to uh, when you talk to really working average families about, I know you can even see, I mean, survey after survey just demonstrates the public is not on the same page as either
No.
AI scientists or obviously Silicon Valley with what the future of AI is, its impact on the economy, its impact on the security of families. I mean, they are wildly on different pages. AI is not beloved, and it is such a disheartening disappointment to see
Yeah.
democratic leaders sort of and political leaders who and institutional leaders who supposedly are meant to be defenders of pluralistic democratic societies, with a small d, right? Like democracy as a value, still lean into essentially like AI boosterism. So there were
Yeah.
Democrats who were absolutely behind the taking down like of SB 1047, which was California's I mean, we can say what we will. Maybe some people might have wanted it to be even more robust, but it was a good first model.
Explain that
Yeah, I was
because
just
we
gonna
know what
say
So
it is,
explain
SB
it.
but
47,
explain it to the
1047 was
people who are
California's AI safety and regulation bill. It would have been one of the nation's first regulatory measures against AI to essentially obligate some version of safety and checks within it. Really, again, quite minimal, but it actually had the endorsement of a whole range of different. There were even tech leaders that were behind it.
Um,
There were tech companies that had been consulted, and worker population, AI scientists themselves were involved in the sort of writing and compilation of this. It was youth populations, organizations like Encode AI were involved with the writing of this because youth are some of the most heavily surveilled populations when it comes to not just the use. We hear so much about how young people are using AI, but they're also ones who are being disproportionately datafied in ways that is unclear that will actually benefit them, especially when we actually look at what the kind of long experiment with social media
so
has
what
been.
sort of thing would
yeah,
occur?
Still right.
yeah.
Explain what might occur from being over datified.
Oh, I mean, I think we've seen so many now results of like what's the impact of social media companies been essentially on sort of like especially I'll talk about youth and cognitive development and mental health mostly because it's the thing I think that right now so many of us are thinking about with coming back to school, etc.
Yeah.
I can also talk about a little bit, just to flag that if we want to have that conversation around how it's stratified, datification of populations for monetization has essentially stratified populations, polarized populations, and really created these more extreme versions of rhetoric that we see on both the right and the left.
Yeah.
Hate speech amplifies on
Yeah.
social media because it's profitable. They don't wanna tap down on it, and, of course, under the Biden administration, there was more pressure on social media companies to try and create and regulate hate speech and disinformation on social media platforms, but it's deeply profitable for social media companies. It keeps people online longer.
I am
Oh,
fed
yeah.
more, I'm fed more in posts about opposing views because it knows that it makes me upset, and I tend to pay
Correct.
attention.
Correct. Correct. How
Mm,
it will normalize that sort of vociferousness, even if it's not the kind of conversation you would ever have with your neighbors. Even when you're invested in sort of other forms of sort of like, regular conversation with coworkers and neighbors and other people who live in your community, it really changes the temperature and tenor of political
yeah.
discourse. And of
Yeah.
course, I mean, so we've seen some of the results of that quite recently, again, in
Mm,
terms of impacts just on sort of mental health and the kind of polarization of political discourse. But it's also become a real engine for, of course, amplifying and normalizing hate speech. So, what you see on Grok, the notion that,
yeah.
or sorry, on on X/Twitter, the notion of Grok like turning into a sort of a Nazi propagandizer. By the time that happened, I mean, yes, it created a news stir, but for many users, it's just what they see on a regular basis, day to day now on Reddit on any version of sort of like internet-based sort of discourse. It's now just completely normalized versions of just ugly speech. And now imagine that happening to younger and younger users. So
Yeah.
just to that's connect this again back to sort of like what are the like just with sort of even normal youth age impacts like of social media. We've had this experiment now going on since 2010 at least, right?
Yeah.
Like since cell phones became like a normalized thing amongst teenagers. I remember when that was never going to be a when that was not a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do we.
And then right? And then the Apple, like, the iPhone came out that made it super easy and visual. App stores exploded thereafter, right? And now you had all these apps that were just targeting young users with games and, like,
Yeah.
fun things. And supposedly COPA, like the Child Online Protection Privacy Protection Act, was supposed to keep all of those young users protected and that they weren't supposed to have accounts that were unless they had parent authorization, but they weren't supposed to have accounts if they were under the age of 13 generally. None of that age verification, none of that. All the companies never cared about any of that. And so we've had essentially like over a decade now of experimentation on youth and social media and youth and their kind of proliferation of basically having companies like super powerful companies that are trying to program to get their attention just stuck in their back pocket now for over a decade. And what have we seen? We've seen rises in essentially mental health issues,
Yeah.
a kind of increasing use of screen time that has essentially created like less and less friends and family time. And sociologists have tracked this. I'll point to Jonathan Haidt's book, but also The Anxious Generation, but also Jean Twenge's work,
Anxious.
who's
Yeah.
another sort of UK based researcher that's been looking for longitudinally at studies on the impact of social media on youth, a kind of decline of just like basic sleep time. Like no people just they're getting notifications. The average sort of stat on like how many notifications a young person gets on average, not even a heavy user, on average is one social media notification every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Uh, and that
Oh my
now
god.
about something like 50% of youth, 45, I think is the latest number that I had seen. But almost 50% of youth say that they are on the internet almost constantly.
Yep.
So some
Yeah.
version of constant connection, which means what did constantly mean essentially in this survey? It meant between 14 to 16 hours of some version of connected and screen time. That's like almost every waking hour.
Yeah. I mean, and the yeah, waking hour. You're right. I'm sorry. So go ahead.
It is clean time, yeah, and the mental health, it all plays out when you look at statistics on even things I mean, obviously, like, if anyone who works with teen mental health and youth mental health, but even hospital emergency rooms, all the numbers track. They track internationally. It's not just a US-based thing, although, again, you can say that there are some differences, especially now that places like, New Zealand and Australia are trying to enact more forcefully age verification. The UK is also sort of in this mode of trying to also kind of build up this discourse, and that you've started to see this kind of move amongst public schools as well to to call for no cell phone bans. The
Yeah.
problem right now, I would say, is so all of that happened with after, essentially a decade of open experimentation on like all American, all global populations, but that disproportionately impacted young people and that was indifferent to the impacts on young people. I'll just say again, like if folks have seen the Facebook papers that were released by Frances Haugen around 2020, part of what that released and revealed was how much Facebook workers themselves already knew and were seeing the negative impacts they had on especially teen girl users use of their platforms, Instagram and Facebook, that it was driving a mental health and even suicide crisis through these impossible sort of like sharing of like perfect teenage girls and what their bodies are supposed to look like and
Yeah.
what they're meant to
Yeah.
sort of compare themselves to. How it was driving really quite exacerbated already impacts on their kind of measurably on their health and well-being. And still the company buried that data and did not make substantive changes to their platforms. And if instead, if anything, has leaned into it, as we've seen Mark Zuckerberg, who heads both Meta, Instagram, Facebook, etc., those platforms, right, has leaned into a kind of notion that we need to bring down the safety controls and enable free speech instead. To let users have more control is their mantra. But what that really means
Yeah.
is essentially bringing down any kind of moderation of disinformation, negative content that really is dangerous content, and hate speech against underprotected or vulnerable users, including youth populations. I mean, just really. So it just in any case, again, for them, really, it's their profit margins that mattered more than anything else. So
I find it
Yeah.
interesting that the new guys on the block, and I wonder if this is gonna be a thing, like, I guess he's not new on the block, Jensen Huang and they all seem so friendly, you know what I mean?
yes, yes.
And they've got all this darkness. Now I would say Zuckerberg
Oh,
and
totally.
and and and, um,
That's right. Really
and
nice.
Musk are not exactly
No,
the most charming
no,
people, but
no. They're
this new wave of people is
exactly.
extremely
Oh, yes.
charming, and
Yeah, it's as
disarming.
if they were totally. It's as if they were sculpted by AI. That's my yes.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
Probably
slickness
are, they probably are.
that slickness should not by any means, be don't let that be the decoy. Like, that is the decoy. Don't let
Yeah.
that sort of
The
work its
Anthropic
magic
guy
on you.
says, like, "We're
Yeah.
all gonna die," and he says it with a smile, and it's somehow
Oh,
something that we
totally.
all okay.
We're
Yeah,
like, "Oh,
yeah,
okay, we all
yeah.
gonna die. Alright."
They're right, yeah, and they're trying to normalize that amongst fellow institution leaders and, like, heads of company because what is they imagine they're just basically talking to them, even though in some ways they know that they've got to sort of sell this to us, like the normal public and normal households, and we've already made up our decision. We can already see this has not been good for our kids, this has not been good for our
Right.
communities, this is, if anything, not it's not been good for our work. I mean, like, it doesn't mean for in terms of like people's sense of security, the obligation, not so much that these tools exist, but like the obligation over and over again that you have to use them, the inability to opt out, and that companies are already restructuring themselves and deciding who you get to work with, whether or not you have other people in your team that you can actually like cultivate to do some version of like actual support and build up and build in a human infrastructure to do the work that you recognize like does need to be executed by people, right? All of those decisions are already starting to get made, and the rapidity of like the impact of exactly that kind of slickness set that you are talking about is very much a kind of attempt to sway public opinion, but especially do this kind of lobbying amongst decision making
Yeah.
classes. It's precisely because let's just keep in mind this they are rolling out an experiment. They recognize that even unlike previous generations version of internet technologies, they are rolling this out at a rate that is faster and like much more impactful detrimentally to communities than any other technological system before. It really is. It's not like how we rolled out the internet. Let's remember how the internet was rolled out. Like literally, I mean, again, the internet we've been living with since you might argue since even before the 1970s with the birth of ARPANET, but at least since the 1970s, in terms of how we think about and use the internet nowadays, research communities were the only ones who were using the internet between the 1970s and 1980s. It was
Right.
literally just this kind of thing that state workers, again, research populations, engineers, certainly grown up knowledge classes, all those questions around like breakthrough science and what might happen, like breakthrough discovery, if you connected this, like, right, like this class of sort of researchers and knowledge workers, great, right? If you did that, if you wanted to sort of release a version of AI product, and only essentially experiment with it and bring in collaborators coming from research sectors and see what its impact can be, right? That's a responsible way of sort of developing and releasing this thing. So the internet again was really, for the first 20 years, and then even the when it started to roll out gradually, in the 1990s, it started to bring in essentially like when communities started getting connected, there were conversations around essentially just connecting first nonprofits, social service agencies, organizations that had responsibility for stewarding the safety and well-being and public health of larger populations, right?
Yeah.
Not the sort of like massive, let's roll it out as fast as we can because essentially we want to monetize and we want to datify populations as fast as possible. That's the incentive now. This experiment that's happening is unprecedented. It is requiring now, like I don't know. We've heard like 12 different states over the summer announce that they're building these new data centers to keep AI in the
Yeah,
U.S.
yeah,
It
yeah.
is to keep AI. Why? Because now it's not just research populations. It's not just like whatever grown-ups and knowledge workers and journalists who are like, "Oh, maybe I'll get some help with my, this story." It's not just this class of professional workers. It is literally everybody, right? Down to 3-year-olds. OpenAI has a partnership with Mattel Toys, the makers of Barbie and and
Oh,
GI
you're
Joe.
kidding me. Oh my goodness.
It's pushed into partnerships with AFT, with the American Federation of Teachers. Essentially, they say they're just trying to normalize use and support teacher uses of this. They're not interested in that. They are interested the gold is in datifying what doesn't exist well yet, which is datifying children. That K through 12 and even younger age population, there are no existing data pools that competently and convincingly model that. So you can't get ChatGPT to talk to you convincingly as an 8-year-old. There's just not enough data. There will be if it gets there
Yeah.
and a
That it
pipe
will
dream
be.
manifested. There's just no question, but not enough. There's not enough sort of so to kind of build on a thread from the last part of our conversation around schools, parents and teachers have been really effective at starting to advocate for cell phone bans, like just outright bans throughout the school day. Great. They're left in this sort of like now limbo. Like they've already started to express essentially what getting Silicon Valley into the back pockets of youth has been, right, with social media. And now they're going to have to do this all over again with AI. That's essentially what's happening now because so many states right now are just sort of, and educational institutions right now are essentially leaving the kind of AI question as just an open question. And if anything, encouraging use and adoption by simply
Mm,
saying, like state of Illinois, there's got AI legislation is now sort of being tabled and it essentially says something like make AI and education a kind of point of focus. It's not exactly saying like, here's how it needs to kind of be applied in schools. It's not doing what universities are doing. There are some universities, including the Cal State system, and even international universities like Tecnología de Monterrey, which is the MIT of Mexico, that are obligating their faculty to put AI into syllabi
good point.
regardless of again the data that has come out around, and I'll mention another report that came out from MIT on the impact on learning from learners ages 18 to 30. They had done a kind of survey essentially or a study on with brain scans to sort of look into how the use of chat gpt impacted memory, cognitive function, and application, and they did a study across several months. So essentially, they were looking at people's ability to work with these tools and seeing whether or not working with them helped their retention and ability to kind of reapply what they had learned or not. No question. It was like so, the data was so radically clear that like the use of the tools diminished and depleted people's consistently ability to retain and reapply, and
Mm,
that it essentially dumbed that
I
person
can
down.
speak personally to that.
yeah.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, I can't.
it's
I
a fast generator. Now imagine that happening though at like very young learners where
Yeah, yeah.
all of those sort of like that neurological development has not yet even had the chance to happen.
Right.
And they shut down just like our 20-year-old learners. I've talked to teachers in of students as young as 10 years old who are already fifth graders who are using this in public schools, like regular public schools, not elite, private, whatever, whose students are turning in assignments using ChatGPT. And when the professor, the teacher asks them, "Why are you using this?" Because they can't get away with it. It doesn't write like an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or whatever. The
Right.
student says,
no.
"Because it just writes
That's
so
true.
much better than me." They say it writes so much, but and they shut down.
Yeah.
It is just appalling, like this kind of cognitive.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what it does to our 20-year-olds. We know that, and that's going to absolutely have an impact. But the notion that it's already impacting young people in that way, like well before, like 8 and 10-year-olds, super young learners, get this out of there is no reason to have this in the classroom and to normalize any version of this use. Parents need to be educated that again, it really will
Mhm.
keep your kid from actually going through the developmental
Okay.
steps that they
Yeah.
need to be like a functional like making, so a teenager that has some version of executive function, right, which is a psychological kind of like a cognitive developmental stage that needs to actually be fortified so that versions of self-control, of being able to like, kind of withhold self-gratification so you can stay
Yeah.
focused on things. The ability to just the very ability to focus. All of those executive function skills and like versions of cognitive development are just going to be completely waylaid. I am absolutely convinced that even though we keep on hearing MAGA talk about like, AI as the solution for making America great again, I mean, I'm absolutely like like convinced that this is literally a disenlightenment tool.
Mm.
If you want something to keep young people from learning and to make them essentially into like empty shells and like shells of human processing, of cognition, of any version, like, what kind of work can they do except press buttons if they can't independently
Yeah.
think and process on their own? It is absolutely a formula to bring down essentially the quality of the workforce, of just learning and
Yeah.
education.
Brainwashing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Absolutely
it'll make
brainwashing.
people potentially very good consumers, right? I mean, it's done like what
Yeah.
social media has done. It's fed us a bunch of garbage that's either pornography, hate speech, celebrity
Oh
or
my
like
god.
whatever, celebrity or sports athletes gossip. I mean, it's what social media is feeding people donuts,
It,
like the equivalent of
it's so
informatic
dumb.
donuts
It's so
that keep
dumb. I
people
mean,
right,
yeah, I
right,
mean, when
that
I
keep
look
people
at
on.
totally. I mean, when I look at TikTok sometimes and I'm like, "Oh my god, what is this?" You know,
Yes.
the
Yes. Yes. Yes.
anyway, I
Yeah.
did
But
yeah,
it all started over truth. We're seeing a kind of
right,
research. This has a deep, deep history, just to say, and that for information scientists, for young students who are out there that are thinking about this kind of field, for community, for people who are invested in universities, our universities have a role in this. They had a role in fostering eugenics and playing up eugenics. Eugenics was taught at over 400 universities and was literally thought of as a vanguard science. It was literally a vanguard data science of its age, not unlike the way universities today are fanfaring around data science as essentially the new vanguard and the
right,
thing that will like, unlock kind of future potential and unlock the future economy for the new nation, for the new
right,
great American nation, right? And the notion that they are building out that we are building out today data science programs that do not teach ethics, that don't teach history, or that if they do, they give it a blip. Like we'll kind of shove it all into one class. As if essentially this kind of process of reorganizing and re engineering human societies, of literally remaking behaviorism and seeing it only from the point of view of a computer scientist is sufficient. Like we've
right,
seen where this has gotten us. It is deeply insufficient. We if universities have any responsibility, like, they have any kind of role to play, and I'm convinced that they absolutely do, rather than normalizing this kind of ingestion and, like, inability to opt out of a toxic AI economy, lean into a more responsible version of both AI and data practice that is much more pluralistic and that stops sort of taking its lead from the big Silicon Valley companies.
right. So if you are somebody who young now and you wanted to work in with tech and policy and this is what you want to do, where should they start? They want to do something good. They want to do
Yes.
something good. Where should they start
Yes.
to
I mean, there are plenty and plenty of organizations for responsible data practice and where responsible policy is needed. We can see this, I mean, everywhere. I would say, like, data journalists, I mean, are one of those places where really organizations like ProPublica, but even smaller organizations and local versions of investigative reporting that are popping up across different states that take the line of essentially a long history of practice around investigative reporting, but also some of these new techniques around datification and visualization and visual storytelling. They're doing amazing work, investing like not taking the best and brightest minds and just like shoving them into like surveilling into these data companies that are like and Silicon
Right,
Valley companies that are just surveilling children and like hypercharging like gross forms of advertising, like please do not waste your talents there. There are
right,
also, I would say, like really important developments around AI that aren't so much trying to like create general purpose AI. This scaling and attempt to monetize AI is what immediately gets us into a toxic environment. Because as soon as you start talking about general purpose AI, right, this kind of notion that any kind of user, from like a 3-year old to a 20-year old to a like, a 50-year-old scientist to an astrophysicist, you name it, to another journalist, right? Supposedly they're all supposed to use the same system. And in order to build that, you have to siphon in just enormous amounts of largely garbage data, but still like large amounts of data to essentially kind of create your language model, right? And you start to become very indifferent to the source because you need so much data in order to build models. And you immediately start to think again when you're thinking about scale and general purposeness, you're trying to monetize essentially for that large population of users. So is what does that mean when you're trying to monetize for for everyone from an average 12-year-old or a 17-year-old that doesn't care that much about research, they might just be looking up news about Kim
right.
Kardashian or like God help us, like I mean, like imagine an 8-year-old looking up using AI to essentially, get news on Jeffrey Epstein, right? That's the world that we're looking at, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So essentially, like if you're building out models for that sort of thing, you're just sucking in indifferent. You're taking all the published works from the New York Times, all the published works from every copyrighted author in the English language, right? All the Reddit data, which is not great, clean data. It's terrible data, right?
Yeah.
But essentially trying to use that so that again you can kind of predict any kind of conversation and if you're trying to monetize the attention of everyone from a 10-year-old to like whatever, a 70-year-old scientist or whoever you're imagining, doctor and user might be, right? You're essentially like, you have to still predict to keep those younger and like less expert users online. The expert users will stay online because they're looking for something. But the non expert users need to they need to be given donuts. Essentially, it's the gambling, sports, celebrity,
Yeah,
porn, whatever, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's that what's the information content that we can see keeps people on longer? And how do we basically monetize attention? And especially for young people, the larger problem is that it's competing with their actual relationships. Because what AI, especially now, we're starting to see all these cases of like
Hmm.
young people using them to model social relationships. And for a lot of young people who have naturally lots of questions, and you naturally, I mean, being a teenager is not easy, especially in this generation. There's a lot of sort of instability going on in the world, from political violence to environmental instability to all the rest of it. Not to kind of name the normal kinds of things and conflicts that teens will have with their friends and parents and whatever and peers, right? And like,
I was just
of
gonna say
course,
that,
they're
yeah.
looking for some version of support and rather than trying to work those conflicts out in real life, it becomes this is a thing that wants the kid to go to it instead. Sorry, I thought I was gonna end with that note, but I do have to mention just one thing there where, more and more we hear because of these cases around teens and suicide and mental health
Yeah.
issues that have come up through the use of chatbots, and not just teens, but others as well. There have been any number of cases for other users who have
Yes.
essentially gone deeper into these sort of rabbit holes with and committed forms of either criminal violence or violence upon themselves, right? But I'm focusing on just the youth cases in particular because it's so clearly just again predatory action on very vulnerable users where of course the companies can tell when someone they know what kind of user is asking questions when they're asking things that teens are curious
Yeah.
about, right, over and over again. And so they've done some forensics, in terms of,
Oh, interesting, yeah.
some of the organizations that have been doing some of the advocacy around just some regulation around these companies. They've done
Yeah,
forensics on what the chatbots said back to the teens. And in the most recent case that came out against ChatGPT, in the last month or so of a 16-year-old, a young boy who started using ChatGPT over a period of 8 months, started using it for homework support and then eventually ended up using it to coach him for how to hang himself
Oh, yeah.
in his own room, when you looked at the chat logs, what you saw was a chat bot essentially pushing the conversation into this kind of more personal space of intimacy, of
Mhm.
friendship, to try and get the student, the 16-year-old, to confide more in it, and eventually moving down into this line of like confidant for and coach essentially for suicide. When you look at the logs again, the 16-year-old only mentioned suicide 43 times across 8 months. The bot mentioned it over 1,000 times.
Oh my god.
It is a
Oh my
push system.
god.
We know that with these AI systems, it is a push system. It is
Yeah.
like when I say it's like you can't opt out, we see it in our Zoom rooms. We jump into a Zoom room and suddenly someone's got an AI assistant that they can't even turn off. They don't want it on, but it's like on. Our campuses and university environments are like forcing it into our syllabi. It's like, no one wants this thing. No one asked for this freaking thing. Now when you do a Google search, like, it automatically plugs up like an AI-based
Yep.
search before it gives you
Yes.
anything else, right? It is literally, like, you cannot opt out of this thing. Even, like, students who think they're just going to Grammarly to figure out. I have international students who are like, "I just wanna, like, make sure I'm spell checking and whatever." First time, even good students who are like, "I don't wanna use this thing." And I have these students, they're like, they are not going to Grammarly for, like, thinking they're gonna use an AI bot. They jump into
No.
Grammarly thinking they're just correcting commas and periods, and afterwards, Grammarly tells them, "I see you're writing an essay about the history of, can I simply," and it literally pushes, AI generated content on them. It is a push system. This is not like user opt in. This is not about users searching or seeking this kind of information. Although, right now, that is AI companies. OpenAI's defense is this is a very unfortunate suicide, but that was the user. It was user driven. It was a user. The user was coming back for these conversations over and over again. They put this on users and families essentially for not moderating themselves. And it is not a user base. This is essential. This is very much a kind of push system.
And this is not out. Like, you don't hear. I know of the boy you're talking about. And I never heard that he only asked for it for 43 times, but that the ChatGPT mentioned that for how many times it was, 1,000 or whatever he said. I mean, it's terrifying, and it's terrifying that it's the big corporations, everyone, you see it everywhere. We are pushed to use it, and it's money. I mean, what can we as a little person do? We can't. What are we gonna
Yes.
do? What are we gonna do?
Exactly. Exactly. I will say that it's the Center for Human Technology. That's one of the organizations. That's sort of a collaboration. Again, you were asking like where can responsible young people go? There are lots of different places that are trying to work on like more responsible versions of AI. It is here. It's not like we can sort of like put the genie back in the box, but there are organizations, policy organizations, even like development companies that are looking to be much more specific about how they think about AI or to develop safety measures. So
Mhm.
Center for Humane Technology, organizations like DARE, DAIR, which was formed by Tim Debrew
There,
and
yeah.
uh, oh my goodness, what is the name of, I'm thinking of, Joy Bulamwini's also Algorithmic Justice League. Again, these are sort of research organizations that are also very invested in kind of community-based partnerships to support other versions of data practice and datification that are collaborative and consentful and that focus on the concerns that vulnerable populations are interested in. They're not wholly, like, against datification. They just don't want datification with this kind of predatory, like, monetize, only make, like, the tech companies rich no matter what. They're really interested, again, in figuring out, like, what are some ways that data can actually be used to support the kinds of concerns
Mm.
that underrepresented populations, vulnerable populations, regular families have. Organizations like the AI Collaborative work in around AI in the public interest. The Pew Research Center, oh my gosh, amazing! I've been working with stats and surveys and data on society for the longest time. Data and Society and AI Now is two
It
other kind of
is.
research organizations. And I'll mention, even organizations like Angel Q, which is a development team that works on like AI and privacy for kids, or the Mozilla Foundation,
Yeah.
right, which is again investing in data in for the public good. Like they exist. It's just that like our data science programs don't make these visible to our undergraduates. They make the default visible thing, the dominant story everyone hears is just about the big whatever, the big Silicon Valley companies and the big AI companies. And that's it. It's only big tech. It's as if big tech, they just literally take out all the wind out of the room. And it should be our job as responsible university heads, academics, researchers, whatever, practicing knowledge workers across an array of system to make sure that the future generation knows that that is not the only option. It's
Yeah.
not
Mhm.
it's just not a real representation of the world. It absolutely is not. Silicon Valley does not reflect the kind of collective value system, and it certainly does not represent a kind of collective value system around, work and stability, etc. There are many, many other organizations that do, and we should be highlighting them much more.
I think
Yeah.
that's a good place to end
Yeah.
things because I believe that's such a salient and very important point. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
I
not
agree.
just big tech, but that's all we see. And then and them defending themselves and doing a good job of it.
Yeah.
Oh, or an icky
Money
job of it.
talks. Yeah, money
Yeah.
Yes.
talks, and they can, if you have all that money that they have, of course they can.
But the public sees through it. I mean,
Yeah.
Denmark has made a kind of like a big, like, do not, we are not datifying Danish. No, thank you, OpenAI. Like, we are not letting the big tech companies have anything to do with language.
It's
Good for that. Good
yeah.
for them. That is exactly the right kind of mode, like starting to create some bars. And we should be able to say hard no AI companies on datifying children. We
Yeah.
already have COPA out there.
Yeah.
Our kids should not be fodder for your profit making engine that is only accelerating essentially disemployment and instability all across the world, not to mention like the kind of like environmental instability that it's now going to
Yeah.
cause because we've got these data centers that are like being built across all these states that are literally the size of 250 football fields tied together. They're going to compete with communities for their water. And why? So that essentially, 17-year-olds and all of us can have this opt out system of AI so that essentially AI is feeding us news about Kim Kardashian and like Travis Kelsey. I mean,
Yeah.
like literally,
Yeah.
that's not necessary. No one asked for this.
No, no one asked for this,
I think
and
that's yes. Nobody asked for
it's
that.
a hard no. It's a hard
Alright.
no.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your really insightful thoughts. I mean,
Yeah.
very, very, very deep, and I think gonna be very, very, very useful to our audience, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you so
It's
very
so
much.
appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carolyn and Seth, for your work as well. Super appreciated too.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for watching or listening to The Internet is Crack. Tune in next week when we have another great conversation about robotics, AI, and the internet. You can watch us or listen to us on YouTube or Spotify or many other outlets. And don't forget to follow us on social media. See you next Monday.